While the world stared at the Strait of Hormuz, waiting for the next headline about tankers and warships, something else was happening inside Iran that almost nobody was covering. In a single 24-hour window, armed fighters struck Iranian security forces in at least 4 separate locations across the western mountains of the country. 4 Iranian security personnel were reported down. The clashes stretched across more than 200 kilometers of rugged terrain, hitting multiple points at what appears to have been roughly the same time. According to the material this is based on, Iran's own Revolutionary Guard is calling these coordinated attacks acts of terrorism, even as its own forces have spent decades carrying out violent crackdowns against the very people now fighting back. That alone would be a significant story. But on that exact same day, something else happened that Iranian state media tried very hard to frame as an unrelated, unremarkable accident. A senior naval commander inside the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the public face of the IRGC Navy, the man who had spent months standing in front of cameras threatening to shut down one of the most important shipping channels on Earth, was reported dead. His vehicle had overturned on a highway in southern Iran. Iranian authorities opened an investigation and immediately told the public not to speculate about what happened. 2 major events: armed uprisings breaking out simultaneously across the western provinces, and a senior military official from the same institution being fighting these uprisings turning up dead on a lonely stretch of highway, all within the same 24 hours. If this is coincidence, it is an extraordinary one. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why so many people who track this region closely believe these 2 events are not separate stories at all, but 2 symptoms of the exact same underlying crisis, a regime that is losing its grip in ways it desperately does not want the world or its own citizens to notice. Let's start with what actually happened in those mountains, because the location matters just as much as the timing. The attacks took place across Iran's Kurdish majority western provinces, in and around towns like Pir and Shar, Baneh, Marivan, and Mahabad. This isn't random geography. This is the exact terrain where Kurdish fighters have operated against the Iranian state for decades, a rugged mountainous stretch of the Zagros range that has always been difficult for any centralized government to fully control. According to the material, these strikes weren't isolated skirmishes. They were spread out, simultaneous, and coordinated in a way that suggests real planning and real command structure behind them, not scattered, disorganized resistance. To understand why that distinction matters so much, you need to understand who Iran's Kurdish population actually is, and what they've been through under this regime. Kurds make up somewhere around 10 to 12% of Iran's total population. They have lived along this western border region for more than 400 years. Their relationship with the current Islamic Republic has been hostile from almost the very beginning. According to the material, shortly after the 1979 revolution, Iran's first supreme leader effectively declared open conflict against Kurdish populations who sought greater autonomy, a conflict that has simmered, flared, and cooled in cycles ever since, but never fully disappeared. For most of the last several decades, that resistance remained fragmented. Different Kurdish parties operated with different goals, different leadership, and often little coordination between them. That fragmentation made it relatively manageable for Iranian security forces to contain, but according to the material, something changed earlier this year that shifted the entire picture. In February 2026, 5 major Iranian Kurdish political parties formally unified under a single coalition, with a clearly stated shared goal, toppling the current regime and securing Kurdish self-determination. For what may be the first time in their modern history, these groups say they are now politically and militarily coordinated under something resembling a unified command structure. This is the part most people watching the broader Iran story from a distance have completely missed. It's easy to focus on nuclear negotiations and tanker seizures in the Gulf and think that's the whole story, but while that's playing out on the surface, a genuinely coordinated internal resistance movement has been quietly assembling itself along Iran's western frontier. According to the material, the coalition includes several distinct groups, each bringing its own history and capability to the table. One faction, widely assessed by regional analysts as fielding some of the most capable fighters in the coalition, operates out of mountain strongholds near the Iran-Iraq border, and is reported to be responsible for a significant share of armed Kurdish attacks on the Iranian regime over the past decade. Another is the oldest and most established Kurdish political party in Iran, founded in the 1940s, with a long history of leading past uprisings against both the monarchy that ruled Iran before 1979 and the Islamic Republic that replaced it. A third group, founded in the early 1990s, fought alongside other Kurdish forces during the campaign against ISIS, and had reportedly already been striking Revolutionary Guard positions in western Iran even before this current wave of unrest began. Rounding out the coalition are additional factions bringing their own decades of experience operating in this exact mountainous border terrain. Put together according to the material, this coalition's combined strength is estimated at around 2,500 fighters, based primarily across the border in Iraq's Kurdistan region, with established infiltration routes running directly into the Zagros Mountains inside Iran itself. These are not inexperienced volunteers picking up weapons for the first time. These are fighters who know this terrain intimately, who understand exactly where Iranian security checkpoints are positioned, and who have operated in and around these mountains for years, if not decades. Their traditional weaponry has mostly consisted of standard light infantry equipment, rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortars. But that's where this story takes a turn that connects directly to a trend we've already seen reshape modern warfare elsewhere. According to the material, first-person view kamikaze drones, the same low-cost, high-impact weapons that transformed the battlefield in Ukraine, are now proliferating across the wider Middle East. And in mountain terrain like the Zagros Range, that kind of technology becomes especially dangerous for a conventional military trying to maintain control. Mountainous terrain naturally creates choke points, narrow passes, and ridgelines that heavily favor whoever holds the high ground. A relatively small mobile force equipped with cheap drones for both reconnaissance and precision strikes can hold and contest ground against a much larger conventional force in ways that traditional infantry alone simply cannot. You don't need an air force to dominate mountain terrain when you have functioning eyes in the sky and the ability to strike armored vehicles with a drone that costs a small fraction of what it costs to lose a tank. This is the strategic reality Iran's Revolutionary Guard now finds itself confronting in its own western provinces. Heavy armored vehicles built for open terrain, being deployed into narrow mountain passes where mobility, visibility, and cheap precision weapons matter far more than raw firepower. Now here's where the story gets more complicated and more interesting, because this coordinated Kurdish coalition did not simply appear out of nowhere in June. According to the material, there's a documented earlier chapter to this story that helps explain both how sophisticated this movement has become and why its sudden resurgence now raises serious questions. Earlier this year, according to the material, there were reports that the sitting United States president expressed support for Kurdish factions moving against the Iranian regime, and separate reporting suggested Israel was actively backing plans to help Iranian Kurdish militias seize territory along Iran's border. A congressional research assessment reportedly noted that earlier military operations against Iran had already done meaningful groundwork for this kind of effort, with strikes against Iranian military positions along the Iran-Iraq border weakening the command infrastructure, air defenses, and logistics networks that had previously restricted Kurdish movement and activity in the region. Around the same period, the 5 major Kurdish factions had already formed their unified coalition, and regional analysts assessed that the conditions had been set for a coordinated cross-border Kurdish offensive. And then, according to the material, that plan appears to have been quietly shut down. Regional reporting suggests Turkey's president personally pushed to scrap the formal plan to arm these Kurdish factions, reportedly after details of the plan were leaked to Turkish officials. Turkey has long opposed any Kurdish military buildup along this border, largely due to concerns about ties between some of these groups, and Kurdish organizations Turkey has designated as terrorist organizations within its own borders. So the official pipeline of support, at least the version reported publicly earlier this year, appears to have been closed down under diplomatic pressure. Which raises the exact question the material puts directly on the table. If that formal support pipeline was shut down months ago, how does a sophisticated, well-organized, multi-party coalition, one that had reportedly already been positioned and prepared for a coordinated offensive back in the spring, suddenly reappear in late June running simultaneous, coordinated attacks across 200 kilometers of mountainous terrain? Something shifted. Either the coalition built up enough independent capability on its own to act without formal outside backing, or new support quietly resumed through channels that haven't been made public. Either possibility tells you something important about how unstable the situation inside Iran has actually become, and how seriously outside powers are now watching for cracks to widen. And the pressure isn't limited to the Kurdish regions alone. According to the material, on June 29th, resistance cells launched a coordinated campaign of their own, far from the Kurdish provinces, in cities including Tehran, Isfahan, and Tabriz. This wasn't armed conflict in the way the mountain clashes were. It involved posters, graffiti, and public messaging calling openly for regime change, timed to coincide with an international summit held outside Paris, where opposition leadership reportedly described Iran's current regime as having reached a breaking point, pointing specifically to internal dissatisfaction with the current supreme leader's handling of the country's mounting crises. So what you actually have, according to the material, is 2 separate internal pressure campaigns running at the same time. An armed insurgency escalating along the western border provinces, and a public, symbolic resistance movement quietly spreading inside major Iranian cities. 2 very different forms of pressure, hitting the regime from 2 very different directions, in the exact same narrow window of time. To understand why a death like this creates such a headache for the regime, you have to understand how much the Revolutionary Guard depends on projecting strength rather than admitting vulnerability. The IRGC isn't just a branch of Iran's military. It functions as its own parallel power structure, with its own navy, its own intelligence apparatus, its own economic empire, and its own direct line to the supreme leader that, in many ways, operates independently of Iran's regular armed forces. Losing a senior, publicly recognized figure from that structure, especially one who had built his public reputation around threatening the United States and controlling access to the Strait of Hormuz, isn't simply a personnel loss. It's a symbolic one. It tells anyone paying close attention that even the men standing at the podium delivering threats on camera are not untouchable, and that is precisely the kind of message a regime built on projecting total control cannot afford to let take root, either among its own population or among the resistance movements now testing its limits. There's also a deeper history behind the Kurdish coalition that helps explain why security analysts are treating this unification so seriously. For decades, Iran's approach to managing Kurdish unrest relied heavily on a simple strategy: keep the various factions divided. Different Kurdish parties had different leadership, different regional bases, and at times, competing priorities that made it relatively easy for Tehran to negotiate with one group while cracking down on another, preventing any unified front from ever fully forming. That strategy worked for a long time. But according to the material, the formal unification of 5 major parties earlier this year represents a direct failure of that decades-old divide and contain approach. When previously fragmented factions agree to coordinate under a shared political and military structure, it doesn't just increase their combined manpower. It removes one of the regime's most reliable tools for managing them. The drone element of this story also deserves a closer look because it explains why a lightly equipped force of roughly 2,500 fighters can realistically threaten a state security apparatus with access to tanks, helicopters, and a far larger conventional military. In previous decades, an insurgency operating with little more than rifles and mortars could inflict damage, but rarely hold ground against sustained armored pushes into contested territory. Cheap first-person view drones change that equation entirely. A single drone, often costing a small fraction of the price of the tank shell it can destroy, allows a much smaller force to neutralize expensive armored vehicles from a safe distance without needing anything resembling an air force of their own. Combine that with loitering munitions capable of circling above a target area and striking only once a valuable target presents itself, and you get an insurgent force that can punch dramatically above its actual numbers, especially in terrain that already favors defenders over attackers. Mountains do the rest of the work. Narrow passes and steep ridgelines turn every advancing convoy into a predictable, exposed target, and a coalition that already knows this terrain intimately doesn't need overwhelming force. It just needs patience, coordination, and the right technology, all 3 of which, according to the material, now appear to be converging in western Iran at the same time. Turkey's role in all of this is worth sitting with a little longer, too, because it shows just how tangled the politics surrounding this Kurdish resurgence actually are. Ankara has spent decades fighting its own Kurdish insurgency within its own borders, and it treats any sign of a strengthening, better organized Kurdish military coalition anywhere in the region as a direct long-term threat to its own security, regardless of which government that coalition happens to be fighting against. That's why, according to the material, Turkey was reportedly willing to intervene diplomatically at the highest level to prevent a formal American-backed arming plan for these Iranian Kurdish factions from moving forward earlier this year. From Ankara's perspective, a stronger, better-funded Kurdish military coalition operating successfully against Iran today could easily become a template, or even a direct pipeline of weapons and expertise for Kurdish movements elsewhere in the region tomorrow, including inside Turkey itself. That single dynamic, one regional power quietly working to contain a Kurdish coalition even while it fights against a mutual rival, tells you just how complicated the incentives are for every outside power watching this unfold. Nobody involved has purely clean motives here. Everyone is calculating not just how this affects Iran, but how it affects their own long-term position in the region. According to the material, the man reported dead was the political deputy and public spokesperson for the IRGC Navy, someone who had been sanctioned by the European Union for his role in restricting navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, and who had repeatedly appeared on camera delivering direct threats against the United States on behalf of the regime. He was, in other words, one of the most publicly visible military figures tied to Iran's ongoing standoff over that critical waterway. State media, outlets directly controlled by the Revolutionary Guard itself, reported that his vehicle overturned, that emergency crews responded, and that he later died from his injuries. Iranian authorities opened an investigation and instructed the public not to speculate about what actually happened. Here's what makes that instruction so notable. According to the material, Analysts who track Iran closely have documented a consistent pattern over the years, where sensitive, high-profile eliminations, whether from internal purges, external operations, or unexplained accidents, tend to get labeled publicly as ordinary accidents or natural causes, specifically in situations where officially acknowledging anything more would force the regime into a public response it may not be ready or willing to make. In other words, calling something an accident isn't just about the facts of any individual case. It's a tool that allows a government to avoid the pressure of having to explain or retaliate for something more serious. Whatever actually happened on that highway, what is confirmed, according to the material, is this. A senior Revolutionary Guard naval commander is dead, and on that exact same day, Iranian security forces were taking armed casualties inside their own borders from increasingly coordinated internal resistance movement. The regime is trying to project total control to its own population, while dealing with what appears to be a rapidly compounding internal security crisis behind closed doors. And all of this is happening while Iran is simultaneously trying to close out one of the most consequential diplomatic negotiations it has been part of in years. According to the material, Iran signed a memorandum of understanding with the United States in the middle of June, opening a 60-day negotiation window that is running right now. The terms being discussed reportedly include no uranium enrichment, destruction of existing enriched uranium stockpiles, restrictions on missile range, and a defined arrangement covering the Strait of Hormuz itself in exchange for sanctions relief on frozen Iranian assets and the ability to resume oil sales on international markets. This is an enormous deal for a regime whose economy has been strangled by sanctions for years. It represents a potential financial lifeline. But it also requires exactly the kind of public concessions that could make the regime look weak in front of its own population. At the precise moment, internal resistance movements are gaining momentum and daring to challenge it more openly than they have in years. This is the trap Iran's leadership now finds itself in, according to the material. Sign the deal and risk looking like you're negotiating from a position of weakness while your own citizens are actively rising up against you. Don't sign it and risk losing access to the sanctions relief the country's economy desperately needs, all while the same internal pressures keep building regardless. There's reportedly growing pressure from within the regime's own leadership structure to finalize that memorandum, driven in part, according to the material, by a recognition among some officials that the cracks forming inside the country are spreading faster than the Revolutionary Guard wants to publicly admit. There's a broader pattern worth pointing out here because it echoes something we've seen play out in other regimes under sustained internal and external pressure throughout history. When a government is fighting pressure on multiple fronts at once, diplomatic negotiations abroad, armed uprisings along its borders, and quiet resistance movements inside its own major cities, the danger isn't usually any single one of those pressures on its own. It's the way they compound each other. A negotiation that looks weak fuels domestic anger. Domestic anger fuels resistance movements. Resistance movements make the leadership look less capable, which puts even more pressure on the negotiating table. It becomes a cycle that feeds itself, and once that cycle starts running, it becomes extremely difficult for a government to fully regain control of the narrative, let alone the situation on the ground. While all of this has been unfolding inside Iran, there's a second story running almost entirely underneath the global news cycle, because so much international attention has been locked onto the Strait of Hormuz. According to the material, Ukraine has been running what may be one of the most consequential drone campaigns of its entire war against Russia, largely without the level of coverage it would normally receive, precisely because the world's attention has been pulled elsewhere. According to the material, sustained pressure has been building against Crimea for roughly 40 days, with a significant volume of drone strikes targeting infrastructure across the peninsula. A major power substation reportedly went dark. A refinery tied to a Russian state energy company was reportedly struck on more than one occasion. What this suggests is a deliberate, sustained campaign designed to isolate Crimea, treating it not as a secure, fixed Russian stronghold, but as a vulnerable target that can be systematically worn down over time. According to the material, there has even been commentary from resistance-aligned voices suggesting Crimea itself could eventually fall back under Ukrainian control if this pressure continues. At first glance, that might seem like a completely separate story from what's happening inside Iran. But there's a common thread running underneath both, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. In both cases, a major world power, Russia in one case, Iran in the other, is dealing with a sustained, difficult to fully suppress pressure campaign chipping away at territory and infrastructure it once considered secure, while global attention is focused somewhere else entirely. In both cases, the pressure isn't coming from a single dramatic event. It's coming from a slow, grinding accumulation of smaller strikes and internal fractures that individually might not make headlines, but collectively are reshaping the strategic picture in ways that matter enormously. There's also a dimension to this story that reaches well beyond Iran's own borders, and it has to do with oil. Iran remains one of the world's significant oil producers, and any serious instability inside the country, whether from armed uprisings along its western border, resistance movements in its major cities, or uncertainty at the very top of its military command, tends to ripple outward into global energy markets almost immediately. Traders and analysts who track this region closely aren't just watching for the outcome of nuclear negotiations. They're watching for exactly the kind of internal fracture described throughout this material, because a regime distracted by domestic security threats is a regime that becomes far less predictable when it comes to decisions about the Strait of Hormuz, about oil exports, and about how it responds to further pressure from the outside world. That unpredictability is precisely why this 60-day negotiating window carries weight far beyond Iran's own domestic politics. What happens inside these mountains and these cities over the coming weeks could end up shaping decisions made in oil markets and shipping insurance premiums, and in foreign ministries thousands of miles away from the Zagros Range. It's also worth pointing out how unusual it is for this many pressure points to converge at once without any single one of them being the dominant headline. In past moments of unrest inside Iran, the world's attention has typically fixed on one storyline at a time: a nuclear standoff, a protest movement, a targeted strike. What makes this moment different, according to the material, is the sheer simultaneity of it all. Armed conflict in the mountains, quiet resistance messaging in the capital, a senior commander's unexplained death, a ticking diplomatic clock. None of these are being allowed to dominate the news cycle on their own, largely because international attention has stayed locked on the Strait of Hormuz instead. But for anyone actually tracking the full picture, that combination of factors happening together, rather than in isolation, is exactly the kind of pattern that historically precedes major shifts inside authoritarian states. Not because any single event forces change, but because the cumulative weight of unresolved pressure eventually becomes impossible for any government to fully manage at once. Iran is currently negotiating a nuclear and sanctions deal with a 60-day clock running. A deal its economy badly needs, but one that also risks looking like weakness to a population already growing more willing to openly challenge the regime. At the exact same time, a newly unified, increasingly capable Kurdish coalition is running coordinated armed attacks across a 200-kilometer stretch of western Iran, using tactics and technology, including cheap precision drones that are specifically suited to overwhelming a conventional military force in mountain terrain. Separately, resistance cells are surfacing inside major Iranian cities, publicly and visibly calling for regime change, timed deliberately to coincide with international attention on Iran's internal instability. And on top of all of that, a senior, publicly recognizable Revolutionary Guard commander has died under circumstances Iranian authorities are actively discouraging the public from questioning. On the exact same day, the regime was absorbing armed casualties from the resistance movement it insists on calling nothing more than scattered terrorism. None of these individual threads, taken entirely on their own, would necessarily suggest a regime on the edge of losing control. Kurdish unrest has flared before and settled down before. Nuclear negotiations have dragged on before without producing regime-altering consequences. Officials in authoritarian systems die under unclear circumstances more often than governments would like to admit, without those deaths necessarily signaling anything larger. But when you look at all of these threads together, happening within the same narrow window of time, compounding and overlapping rather than occurring in isolation, the picture that emerges is one of a government facing pressure on more fronts simultaneously than it has in years, and struggling to fully contain or even fully explain any of them. The 60-day negotiating window currently running is not just about uranium stockpiles and missile ranges. According to the material, it may end up being remembered as the window during which the world got to watch, in close to real time, whether a government under this much simultaneous pressure can actually hold itself together, or whether the cracks now forming along its mountainous western border, inside its own capital city streets, and reportedly within its own military leadership, finally become too wide to paper over, with denials, investigations, and instructions to the public not to speculate. Because that is ultimately the lesson sitting underneath everything in this story. Regimes rarely collapse because of one single dramatic event. They weaken the way a structure weakens under repeated, compounding stress, one crack spreading into the next, until the pressure holding everything together finally gives way. Right now, according to everything laid out in this material, Iran's regime is absorbing pressure from its negotiating table, from its mountains, from its own city streets, and possibly from within its own senior ranks, all at the same moment. Whether that pressure builds into something the world cannot ignore, or quietly recedes the way it has in past cycles of unrest, is something only the coming weeks will make clear. But one thing is already certain. While the cameras stayed fixed on the Strait of Hormuz, the real story was happening in the mountains, in the cities, and possibly on a quiet highway where a general's convoy never made it to its destination.